Boy, well, let's see if we got enough seats. You think we got enough seats?
Hope so. Good afternoon, family.
Good afternoon, Rowdy.
Come on, George. Okay, so what we want to do is, George has got some thoughts for you, and I've got some thoughts for you. We're starting from the premise that we often talk about the TC as a self-help methodology, but we don't take it that next step further. What do we mean when we say a self-help methodology? What we mean is the implication has to be that residents themselves need to understand that methodology. And if that's what we want to do, then we have to be clear about it ourselves. And George, you have some thoughts about fidelity, and that would be useful to hear now.
I want to take your statement and put it in a little bit of a context. And it's a personal one, and it's mine, and that is that over the years I've been increasingly, and this may be my disorder, but you'll validate this or not. It's been my experience that the TC as an approach has is misunderstood, B is in general in decline, and has kind of eroded, or at the very least has taken a different trajectory. And some of the reasons for that are obvious. There are some external reasons for that: the funding issues, the political issues, the paradoxical rise of the whole drug treatment system in the world, and the refocus lately on recovery even. All things that look good, and they are good from a historical point of view in terms of the issues of human services, mental health, but TCs in particular have been a casualty of that for some of those external reasons. Funding, shortening terms of treatment, and so on, and all of which I think we have some familiarity with. And even though we've kind of whined about that for a number of years, we've known about those factors, those factors alone do not account for what's happening to the approach, which I would say is the words I've used, a kind of erosion, a kind of decline. And to blame it all on the system and to blame it all on the funding and the policies is not enough of an explanation. It's valid, there's no question about that, but it's not enough of an explanation. And that leads to the second so one reaction I've had to that is that it's been kind of disheartening for me to see this as the trajectory of the TC, that this happening. That's partly the professional side, science side. It's also the personal side. A lot of my work and my life's work has been in that. And the notion of, this drops to a negative footnote at best, you know what I mean, is not a very exciting outcome, So I have a personal investment in this workshop. So I'm counting on you to give me the therapy that I need, but that's it. So this evolutionary statement has been the context for this workshop for me, which is, you say, well, summarize what's wrong. Well, what's wrong, certainly the TC fidelity, the word fidelity, which means faithful to, which in our case would mean faithful to what we think is our best understanding, or what I would today call the theory of the TC. What's the best understanding? Do we really implement programs which are consistent with what we really understand as the approach? And to even further shrink this whole proposition, I've said, look, the only thing I'm interested now in telling my colleagues and sharing with my colleagues is really one view, and that is the therapeutic community approach has evolved from practice, not from theory, but from practice, has evolved a method. So it's different from evolutions of other kinds of services, which usually begin with some theory, and then they develop some kind of a practice orientation. What I feel we've learned is that over some 50 years, we've had clinical experience and supported by a certain amount of research to essentially lead us to a method, which is distinctively the TC method. which doesn't mean that it's a method which, even though it's distinctive, is alien to other approaches and other social psychological approaches that are valid. As we'll say later, there's a lot of consistency with what we do in the TC and what social psychology and other methodologies do. So there's consistency in that, and that's a good thing, you know. So we're not off the planet in what we've developed. But nevertheless, that method is very distinctive, and it's not even captured in mutual self-help or mutual aid or any of that. The TC method has some very critical distinctions, and if those distinctions are not acknowledged, understood, if they're not articulated and understood, then we cannot even implement it right. And then my diagnosis has been is that our own people have not understood we have really had a method here. And as a result of that, we implement what we do in various ways and often moving far off course from where it should be implemented. And the outcome, or if you like, the kind of consequence, the ultimate cosmic consequence of that, is that it can all get lost. It can get lost, and in my darkest hours, I see it getting lost. This is not one of those hours. So you see, I'm trying to rescue myself on this, but so it won't get lost. And I think I want to do this workshop, and I wanted to do it with Rowdy too, because he's raising some issues that help dramatize what we mean by method on this. And so I'm still in the camp of, despite all of these barriers that we've discovered, I want you to know that there is a profound method that has been cultivated. It was never best in the old days. This is another myth. So this is not an appeal to go back to the old days and say that's what we should be doing. In my delusion, what I envisioned for myself, and as a scientist and as a worker in this field, is that the elements of the method were gradually being extracted, and that was part of a lot of my work, both from research and training, to try to extract what that method was, and then finally articulate it as, in some ways, as parsimoniously as we can. So we're not telling a big elaborate story, but a very straightforward story of what that method is, and then refine it, make it better and better. Not that it was at its top form, you understand, back in the 1960s or 1970s. It was better than what many programs are doing now, and it laid the foundation for the development of that method. So it is both, there are two directions on this. There's what we've learned over the years and where we should be going. And I'm saying this again with non-naivety, with full knowledge that we have barriers against this. And I don't want you to think I'm simply an old codger who just wants the world perfect, you know what I mean? I really do, but that I'm hoping to see if you agree with this, and then if you do agree with it, could we go forward with such an agreement? Are there steps to take around this? Hey, there's a method here. How do we preserve it? How do we make it better? And then the first step on that, of course, is doing first, as a very, very first step, action-oriented step, is that we really have to agree together that we maybe have to learn this method. And it's not very complicated. It's within everybody's reach, and they think that we've been doing it. But when you finally get back to it, it gets summarized in many ways, and I'll give you one definition that I use and I try to invent to try to capture this. But it's going to be very, very straightforward in terms of what we know about the client, what we know about the disorder, and then essentially what elements of the program have to exist, and it gets summarized in this why we do what we do. And that's a phrase also I introduced, I remember, to the Ohio correctional system, if you remember that. Oh, there you are, there's Ohio. So I still remember it, I'm still there, okay. Yeah. Why we do what we do. And that simply meant every single element of a TC and every activity of a TC has a purpose. And if you can articulate what those essential elements should be, and B, explain why we do what that is, and then C, how do we do it? Are we doing it right? And then D, assess whether the outcome of that is essentially what we expected. You run a morning meeting, what's the objective of the morning meeting? How do you do it? And did we reach that objective? So it's in that vein that I really wanted to have this discussion with you, and I was hoping that, and I'm leaning heavily on you actually, so that I'm not simply raving on like this, but that in fact, some of the points that I would like to see made will come from your questions as you begin to raise, your understanding of what we're talking about. So that's my opening line.
Yeah,
So,
it's good.
and to move quick, I'm trying to learn from the session this morning. How do we do it? How do we do it better? And I'm not sure we're doing it any better. I realize that I might be raving on here. But if I had to capture this idea of the method, I tried to formulate it curiously in a definition. Alan Leshner was the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and during my active years in research, NIDA funded my entire life, so I've been on the taxpayers, dole for some 35 or 40 years. I'm no longer on that, but he would always ask. He was a kind of supporter of what went on in the therapeutic community, but he's a brain guy, and he's as is the current director, and he would always ask, well, what are they doing in there? He wanted to know what was the active ingredient? Just give me, what's the pill that they got there? What do we need all these? Why do we need the house? Why do we need a residence? So he compelled me to think about this, and this is what got my thinking on. We needed a definition and not a description. Every account of the TC, characterization of the TC, is always done descriptively. You know what I mean? And once you're doing that, you're not talking about a method anymore. You're talking about a description. It's a place where people get together, they engage in mutual self-help, and no picture comes across about what we do, and certainly not a methodology comes across. So I said, well, and I want to offer this to you, and you can consider it and reject it if you like, but I'd like to see it as a point of departure on this. If we are a community, using an illustration, this room, then the therapeutic community approach is to use community as method. There's a lot of distinctions in there, I'll come back to you, and if community is a method, what we mean by that is that this community is a purposive community. So the method says, community as method is when a community intentionally or purposely uses the community to teach the individual to use the community to change themselves. So if I have a new resident coming in, this is what I say to them. You come in here, if you come into this room where we all are, what we're going to do is teach you how to use us and everything we do here to help you change yourself. So in the end, it's all about the individual. It's not about the community. The outcome is the individual. So this relationship between the individual and the community is what I'm trying to stress in this, to capture the method of the TC. A community that intentionally, essentially, teaches the individual to use that very community to change themselves. So you'll ponder that. It's written in several places in case you forget it, but you'll ponder that because that's really where I'm coming from. Now notice some other distinctions, then I'll stop and turn to this introduction, but a couple of other distinctions. The phrase therapeutic community is really two words, therapeutic, which means to heal, which doesn't necessarily mean behavior change, but it means to heal, and community, communities that heal. Well, when you look at that phrase, there are many, many communities that heal that do not use community as method. So that's a distinction I want to puzzle you with right away. We can call ourselves therapeutic communities, but it turns out that's a very generic term. There are many communities in the world that heal people. There are religious communities that heal people, as examples of that. There are communities in the school that people get healing effects. You can go into a sober living setting, and if they've got any kind of element, any fragment of community, you'll see some healing effects. So the notion that, that a therapeutic community is one kind of an approach is in many ways a misguided one. And we use that phrase, we say we're therapeutic communities, but when we do that, you already know now that we're taking on a universe of approaches. Communities that heal. People, in my experience, when any group gets together and starts to share some norms and live together and do things, you'll see some effects. You'll see healing effects. That's why we were able to see TCs out in the farms and out in various settings where it didn't look very much like what we were running in downtown New York or something, and yet you see healing effects, So, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the distinction I'm emphasizing it, but they're not using community as method. And when we get closer to that, we start to see things like, well, we have certain activities that we've put in here. We've got meetings, we've got groups, we've got affirmations, we've got correctives, push-ups and pull-ups in that language. We've got privileges, we've got sanctions, and so on. When we look at these elements, we're saying, A, there are some essential elements that have to be there, and they are there for a particular purpose. And that's why we're beginning to talk about them in terms of methodological terms. Why we have to have a morning meeting, why we have to have a seminar every day, why do we have to have a meeting, an evening meeting, a business meeting, why we have a big one, which is the structure of the TC, the so-called hierarchical structure. What is the meaning of that? Why do we have that in place? And so when you begin to lay out, at the very least, 6 or 7 of these essential components or activities and elements that go in there, we're saying each of these has to be there because they have both a management and a clinical objective to them. And the proper, their presence and their proper implementation has to be there because we're trying to achieve a certain objective. So I'm highlighting this business of method so that it says to us that, well, once we understand that, we can then begin saying there are TCs that absolutely adhere to that method, put a structure in place, have a proper number of meetings, have a proper number of groups. Meetings and groups are different, right, folks? Meetings are the whole community. Groups are a subset of the community. Proper number of those. And even the nature of, let's say, those groups that we run. The hallmark group in the TC was the encounter group, if you remember. That was the great contribution that the TC made to group process, as a matter of fact, in general. The encounter group. It was, and the way they run their encounter group, even though Carl Rogers saw encounter elements in other groups, he was most impressed with the addiction encounter group. I've mentioned in the morning, this morning meeting, that I remember having that conversation with him, or something like that conversation with him, back in 100 years ago, whenever it was. So so we're going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by the element or the activity, why we do the activity, and why we then say this is part of this designing the method. I want to just add something I didn't say this morning. Is in characterizing a community that is a method. This is for me another part of the learning process. If we're going to say we use community as method, we mean that the definition says this community will teach you how to use us, how to change yourself. But then if you're saying when a community is functioning as community as method, there's 1 or 2 concepts in there that are very, very potent and distinguish community as method, in my view. And that is, one is the community itself provides all of the resources for learning. And that is that the very physical environment, every relationship, and every activity, you got to learn to use to change yourself. You got to learn how to use that to change yourself. But the second one is that the community itself sets the expectations for how you'll participate. This is part of the community's obligation about how they're teaching you. They're teaching you through community expectation. That is what we want to say, just like good parents. We want to essentially this is the way you should participate in a morning meeting, and this is, now I'd like to add in the new generation of TCs, this is why you should be doing it this way. And so the community sets the expectations. The community itself, all of us as community, continually monitor, so to speak, follow whether you're meeting those expectations, because we're always observing each other, and we're obligated to do that. That's part of the method. We're obligated to look at each other and whether we're actually doing what we're supposed to be doing. And then the third element is that the community will respond to those expectations. That is, if you're meeting them, we're going to give you a lot of affirmation, and we're going to give you a lot of support, and we're going to give you a lot of reinforcement. If you're not meeting them, we're going to give you more feedback about how to correct yourself. That's the correction side of that. So you notice that in this characterization of method, the community is essentially setting the standards for performance, continually monitoring you and giving you feedback, and then finally giving you essentially further affirmation and corrections about how you can change that. Now that, in my view, we all know this, there's nothing original in what I'm saying. What I'm trying to put together for you is that this, when you simply hear what I just said, this is the method. And if you can look at any TC and then ask the question, are we implementing community as method? You have a kind of simple guideline to ask you whether you're doing that. I walk into many community settings where, one, you may not see a hierarchical structure. It's a very significant element that may not be there. But the most important deletion that I see in the evolutionary process is that I don't really see the community setting the expectations. I don't really see the community essentially continually meeting its obligations of whether you're doing what you need to be doing and giving you the affirmation and corrective feedback in a reliable way. Now that's simply a quick example of when we want to talk about methods. So it shouldn't be unfamiliar to you at all. What we're going to come back to is how faithfully do we really understand that? B, do we really have all those critical elements? C, do we really implement those elements in the way we should be doing it? Is the community really a community that is essentially setting and meeting expectations for itself? So let me stop for the moment, and
Okay.
then I'm going to move on. Go ahead.
My turn now.
No, sort of. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've spent a certain amount of time in the last few weeks going through the abstracts for the conference, and one kind of sticks in my mind. We were talking about this a few minutes ago, although actually from your opening statement it now feels like a few hours ago, but there we
No
go.
kidding. Is that the opening statement from the morning or this afternoon?
So somebody's abstract, and I won't say who, I can't even remember who, was talking about introducing new evidence-based elements into the TC. And I read the abstract and I almost wanted to ring the author up and say, "Look, you've got to change that." And the reason it struck a very sensitive chord with me is that the implication there is that what we're already doing isn't evidence-based. Yeah? It's a bit like people used to, in the UK, people used to talk about democratic therapeutic communities. And it used to drive me crazy because the implication is what we were doing wasn't democratic. Well, I'm sorry, it is. And yeah, it is evidence-based. And one of the reasons that we were talking this morning, I'll just briefly talk about it again. Zinberg's biopsychosocial model, which many of you will be familiar with, basically says there are three elements to addiction, okay? So he calls it drug set and setting. So basically there's a biological element. So, there may be some kind of predisposition. There may be a parallel disorder to which addiction or the use of drugs or intoxication is appeared to be a temporary fix. So there's that. And you will arrive at a treatment service in physically poor shape. So there's this biological element. There's the setting. This is your external landscape. Your relations with your family and people you knew before you started using will be messed up, probably. Maybe destroyed, okay? Your employability will be low. You're probably in poor housing, maybe homeless. So that's the external landscape. Then most important of all is the internal landscape. How you feel about yourself, what you think people say about you when you walk out of the room, okay? The level of self-esteem. Now those three elements, according to Zinberg, make up the addiction phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying that the therapeutic community was based on the biopsychosocial model developed by Zinberg, because Zinberg actually came up with it after the establishment of the therapeutic community. What I am saying is, I wrote a report here, I'd forgotten about this until today. We were invited in to do, myself and a guy called Salvatore Raimo, were invited in here about 50 years ago, I think, to do an audit, an organizational audit of Coolmine, and we called it Precious Inheritance. And I still think what we have in the TC movement is a precious inheritance, and sadly it's an inheritance that we've undervalued, okay? We've not established in our own heads that this is an evidence-based process that we need to be proud of. And we don't need to add all this other stuff. Okay, and George talked about the erosion of the model, and he's right, except that in this case, the erosion isn't about stuff being worn away and disappearing. It's about other stuff coming in and stifling our original ideas and methodology. And I was talking to some residents earlier and saying the nuttiest thing I think I ever heard was a therapeutic community I visited not terribly long ago, where funders had insisted that every resident in the TC got a set number of hours of individual anger management training. I'm sorry, but actually the whole therapeutic community is anger management training. You know, what's that about?
24/7.
So yeah, so let's just, at its very simplest, the therapeutic community is a very delicate balance between a highly regulated, often stressful but therapeutic structure and the release, the group. So the triangle and the circle, it's a balance between those two. And so often I hear people saying, well, you know what, there's this new stuff called motivational interviewing. We should introduce that. Oh, great. Yeah, excellent. Well, when are we going to do that? Well, I tell you what, Wednesday afternoon, residents aren't doing anything. They're just going around mowing the lawns and cleaning the house. We can do it then. I'm sorry. You can't take away half of the triangle and still expect it to balance with the circle. There comes a point when you don't have enough floor work, you don't have enough triangle to provide material for your group. And that's where we're getting the erosion. Now, I'm not saying by any manner of means that, and I've said this before, I'm not saying that the TC was based on Zinberg. What I would say is it would appear to me that the TC is the only intervention I'm aware of that systematically works on those three elements. And what's paradoxical, interestingly, is that if you look at most methadone maintenance prescribing services, they will tell you they work to the biopsychosocial model, but actually it looks as if they're working to the disease model, because they're doing very little about the set and next to nothing about the setting, because that's somebody else's business. If you look at AA or any of the other 12-step fellowships, they will proudly say that they work to a disease model, but guess what? You can't go to a meeting where they won't tell you, well, actually, you know, it's not just about stopping drinking. You're going to have to stop going in the pub and meeting with all those old cronies. And hey, you're going to have to stop behaving like a drunk as well as stop being a drunk. So actually, AA in practice probably works closer to the biopsychosocial model than they really think they do. So all I'm saying there is that if we want to convince ourselves, and we ought to convince ourselves that this is an evidence-based process, we need only to look at other evidence-based theories of addiction and see the startling parallels between Zinberg's biopsychosocial model, people like Best and Lode talking about recovery capital. All of these things fit that three-part model, and the TC delivers on all three.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but as I've shared with you, I don't like it. In my view, the simple statement about the relationship between the TC and other approaches from an evidential point of view is that this approach has developed community as method, and I hope we're going to spend the rest of our time outlining a little bit more about that, but its relationship to other approaches, the way I'd frame that is that it's consistent with what other science has demonstrated in other approaches. What we do is we found no inconsistency in that. But beyond that, I don't even want residents to be talking about that. What I'm only interested in is they learn community as method in the setting, in the therapeutic community settings as we understand it. And the reason why is not because I have some blind religious, commitment to this.
Sure.
It's that when we look at all of the years of outcomes, and the simple, straightforward findings, as you know, are related to length of stay in treatment, duration of treatment, and then ask the question, and what it predicts is that the longer they stay, the better they do, and completers do best. And Coolmine reported yesterday, right, in their talk, they got a 72% success rate among their graduates, which is very consistent with the old numbers, the original numbers that we all saw. And you ask the question, well, why are they successful in the TC? We never answered that question by talking about Zinberg or recovery capital. We never talked about it that way. We talked about it whether individuals essentially, as they move through stages of treatment, were beginning to show the changes that we loosely described as the increasing maturation, an increasing socialization, increasing autonomy, increasing self-understanding, increasing identity change, all things that came out of their direct experience in the TC. They needed no other theory, just came right out of their actual experiences. So we've concluded, I did, and some of the researchers concluded, is that the best understanding of those outcomes are really what actually had happened to clients in the TC experience, and then beginning to understand what that was all about, and that was the issue of the relationship between the individual and the community. So I don't need any of those. I don't need Zinberg. I don't need Maslow to explain these outcomes. We know actually how to bring it about. And we know that if clients essentially will practice the method, we will get the changes. Let's take a moment. Let's first see if there's anything pressing that you want to say, because then I want to get into kind of phase 2 of this discussion and give you some illustrations of what I mean. But what else is happening with you? I'm just checking in with you now.
You made a point earlier, George, right at the beginning, about participants understanding the process they're going through. And I think this is something that maybe we miss out on. And I think, just thinking back several years to this thing about blind faith, if you query why am I doing this? Why am I sitting in this room with people and this is happening to me? And someone would come up with, you have to have blind faith. You've got to accept that, and that can get, the individual can get lost in this sort of, well, I don't really understand what's going on, but it's still happening to me, but then, why am I doing this?
Okay. Yeah, we were
That's
talking about
good
that.
point, the whole point.
Yeah, we were talking about that this morning, and really introducing. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that the TC can't be modified, can't be developed and further. What I'm saying is we need to understand what we've got in the first place before we start adding, and we were talking this morning about one of the reasons why we shouldn't be kind of willy-nilly adding different stuff, let's have another yoga group, or let's have a bereavement meeting or whatever it is. it's not just about the squeeze it puts on the amount of floor work time you've got. It's also because it begins to confuse the residents, seriously confuse them. And you know that when I was writing the guide for Phoenix Futures, I spent a lot of time with residents, and we would go into, I can't even remember what they were called. I remember one was called an orientation group, and I went into the orientation group, and we came out, and I'm sat with residents saying, what was that about? And they said, well, I don't know, we're just supposed to go into a group every Wednesday, and it's called orientation. I said, well, what's it for? I don't know. Now, as soon as residents are saying, well, I don't know what it's for, I don't know what it does for me, then we're losing our way, you know? And I was very heartened when we produced the guide, and we were given, I think Phoenix still does, give every resident a copy of the guide as they come through the door. And what I found very heartening was that it's the residents who really read over it and then challenge the staff and say, well, that's not what it says in the manual. And the staff have to say, well, just give me 5 minutes in the office, so I'll get back to you on that. That proves, I think, exactly what we're saying about TC method, that it comes from the bottom up. This isn't about staff doing stuff to people.
Go ahead.
Talking about the circle and the triangle, I was so lucky to have been aware of a TC that didn't work. That was the first month.
Yeah.
And it completely changed by two things: introducing encounter groups,
Right.
Yeah.
and starting a structure, which was
Yes.
very hard in those days because it was everything should be democratic discussions.
Yeah.
And then we found out it is avoiding conflicts,
Mhm.
and people need to work with conflicts.
Right.
And, you can find therapies that work on understanding. You can find therapies work on behavior. You can find therapies work on emotional. And I think if you work on only one of them, the rest will follow. But it doesn't follow. I'm saying the thing in the TC, you work on all those elements. It works on expressing your emotion, finding out, for instance, that being angry at a person is not rejecting a person,
Sure.
that sort of thing. That you can express it.
Sure.
And I was, as a psychiatrist, learning that you can be angry at a person, and it was good for the person, instead it was bad for the person, but also good for you.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it is important that you understand how you are, that you don't have to be perfect, again, you can make mistakes and still feel good about yourself, and also that you can change and have to, like the act as if thing, that
Sure.
as if you are not angry by doing it, you learn how to do it.
Yeah.
Those things I had never learned in my training as a psychiatrist, and it was so much different. So I think this is so so important. When I talk to people, say, "Oh, we don't scream anymore in groups." I say, "What? What's happening? No emotions when you are in a group talking about things going not well in the house. You can not hold a person anymore as a
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
this whole thing."
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
No, that's all good. And again, I want to actually go back to some of these points, but I want to make sure that
yeah.
if there's anything that you need to say now, then we'll go forward.
Just, I don't want to say anything particularly about the ATCA standards because I'm going to do a workshop on that tomorrow.
Okay.
But I think one of the things that, when we were writing them and what they're really heavily based on is the essential elements.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting, the points you're making about that kind of erosion because, of course, this is why we developed them in the first place. Because, as we know, all sorts of things have happened. So, the good old days that, Bob Campbell and others of us would remember of, long-term therapeutic communities where people, you kind of trained your staff and so people were coming through the program and coming back in and working in the program and so on. Those days have largely changed, and they've changed for all sorts of reasons. One being the fact that many of our programs have become shorter. Actually, it's interesting. I was doing a survey amongst Australian programs just the other day, and because I wanted to know about their waiting list, because this is a big issue at the moment in Australia about the lack of beds and the waiting list. And one of the programs came back and said to me, so it's interesting you just asked us about our waiting list, you didn't ask us about our retention. And the reason why we have a high waiting list and why we're actually bringing in fewer people is that actually all our people are staying longer. And so we're actually seeing really high retention rates beginning to happen. And that's pushing out the length of stay as well. So it's kind of an interesting kind of shift. But what's also happened when we go in and we do an audit, you know, we go in with the ATCA standards. Of course, it's not just the staff who are involved in that; all of the residents are. And so the auditor, the peer auditors, will be going in and they'll be doing resident groups and talking to the residents and so on. And consistently, we find that people who actually understand community's method are the residents, and often not the staff.
Yep.
And so you are getting that kind of teaching from the bottom up coming up again. So sometimes their understanding about what we do and how we do it and why we do it is actually intuitively better than staff. And sometimes that's because, and this is not only the reason why we have ATCA standard, but why we also now have a TC training course happening, is that we're having to train people about what all these things are about, because they're very good people coming in from outside with mental health and social work and psychology and blah blah blah, fantastic, but they don't have a damn clue about how a therapeutic community works. And so so there's this kind of really interesting, what we're finding in our context in Australia and New Zealand, there's this really interesting kind of process happening, which is, it's almost kind of like a revival actually happening, because there is that kind of bottom-up stuff beginning to happen.
Well, those are encouraging statements if you're saying a revival, but I think the message that I would want to just add to that is that understanding, that training, should be grounded in this statement that there is a real method here, and everybody has to understand what that method is. And then the roles around that method, staff and even professional staff, all will get very well defined by that. Then what's the role of staff in the community as method model? What is the role of staff? It's actually a profound role. The issue of professionals coming into TCs always had the threat to the professional that they lose their professional status somehow. And they had to make adjustments around residents and patients somehow being people who had some kind of authority. Some of those old professional ego problems. One way you solve all that is with even the new generation of professionals, because they're pretty haughty also. They think that their professional training qualifies them in certain ways. What essentially helps them on this is when they get the message that there is a very, very sophisticated method in the TC. And they need to learn that method in order to be effective in the TC. And once they can identify that this advances their professional training, it advances what they're learning in life. That came out of my personal experience as a professional, and it came out of your personal experience. What did it teach me as a professional? Once they get that, and they see the authenticity around this method, they see the logic around the method, and they see how consistent it is in many ways of what they actually learned about human change anyway, and begin to see the possibility that therapeutic communities and communities method has the capability of moving many people at one time rather than simply one person, which I keep seeing is the potential real transformative effects of the future of this approach. It can essentially address many people at the same time in a way that other approaches don't. One-on-one is the most minimalist approach, even if you had the most skilled therapist, you know what I mean? What's the cost benefit of that in the opiate epidemic that we now have? So the issue is going to be, can we get together in this room on the clarity of community as method. I'd like to even use that language, and it has nothing to do with me as an inventor of that. It has to do with the future perception of the TC, you know what I mean? Rather than see it as a place and as a residence and as a setting, see it as a very, very sophisticated methodology. And if we can get together on that, that will be the lifeline for moving the TC forward in the future. I want to put a semicolon on this and just use a couple of examples of what we're talking, make sure we don't miss what we mean by this. And I hope these will be obvious to you and you won't be bored about it, but let's try using just 2 or 3 critical elements in the TC to illustrate this discussion. And this came out of early discussions with Max Jones and everything. Why do we have a hierarchical thing? And I remember how to try to convince Max of the humanitarian benefit of that, you know, because he was so worried fascistically about what was going to happen to the clients on this. We have a structure in the TC, right? We have essentially a resident peer structure. Everybody agrees to that. We say it's an essential element in there. Okay? The question for the room, and I'll open this first with some of the residents. Why do we have that structure? That is, we have the structure to manage the environment.
Well, a lot of people come in here without structure in their life, you know, because they had a chaotic life all their life, so that's why they need some sort of structure.
Okay, so now you see the second response. First one was a kind of management response. You need a structure to manage this place. But then you said our people come in with no structure in their lives. And now you're now talking about a clinical issue, something about the individual. Of course, the next question would be, okay, you need a management structure, but the big change in mental health is we're saying put that in the hands of the residents. Put that management in the hands of the residents. That's where you immediately run into the first barrier in all of mental health.
Yeah.
So you're saying, and quite right, and I agree with you, as well, our clients have a deep structural issue in their lives in terms of the order of their lives and managing themselves. And your answer, if I heard you right, is that if we put them in a certain social role in that structure, they will be in a position to address that issue in their lives. That will be a clinical issue that they can now address, that you can never address in a one-on-one counseling session. You can talk all day about that. Put them in that role, and you now have an ability for them to learn how to change in that role. Go ahead, Martin.
Another one is responsibility.
Responsibility.
Yeah.
Taking responsibility, right? We say that the hierarchical structure, it increases increments of responsibility, right?
Yeah.
You automatically step up, I think, when you're in orientation and with the structure, when you go through your peer, you automatically step up in the program, you know, you take responsibility.
Right. Good statement. Any more on why?
About safety as well, isn't it? The structure creates a sense of safety within the community. People coming from that chaotic lifestyle with no structure, they come here, they feel held within that. So.
That's true.
Reward system
Yeah.
also. In terms
Yeah.
of moving up, getting responsibility, feeling like that you're making progression, and acknowledgement that you are making progression, but also then you're giving back to other people, showing that actually, you know, you can be where I am in a short space of time. So it's that reinforcement that that guy
Yes.
can do it, I can do it. But also, you know, we work well on the reward system. You know, we want to feel good about ourselves, and we also want to for other people to tell us that as well.
What we have is an incredibly complex and sophisticated tool at our disposal. And you're right, it helps us manage a big facility with lots of people in it. But it isn't just that. If it was just that, here's the chef example. If it was just that, we get a new resident who happens to be a chef in a Michelin-starred restaurant. Let me ask the residents, where's the last place we put that resident? He's not going in the kitchen. Why is he not going in the kitchen? Exactly right. So we're using this structure for something else. We're not using, and that's a central issue. A therapeutic environment is not the same thing as a comfort zone. It's different, right? So yes, this structure it is infinitely adjustable. We can say, well, this particular person within this structure, he needs, in Scotland we say a kick up the arse. He, he needs some motivation.
So,
So we can adjust people within that structure for their own individual benefit. We've got a system so that at the lower end of the structure, people can look up and say, well, that's my next goal. I want to be assistant head of gardening. And that seems achievable because I've seen other people achieve that. I learned that at that lower end, I learned to take orders and not just say, well, do the fucker yourself. Oh, that was on film. You can take the boy out of the scheme, George.
I know.
So at the upper end of the scheme, you've got people learning the difference between bullying and ordering and giving instruction. Those are two very different things. You know, people might be used to telling people to do something for me. What they're not very good at is giving instruction, which is a much more positive way of using your authority. So people are learning that. People are learning how to be role models. Yeah. Sorry,
It's giving directions.
yes, yeah, exactly.
well, you're illustrating, that's good. I mean, the responses to the question, why do we have a structure? You notice how easy the answers came, particularly from the residents. And there were two components to the answer. There's a management, there's a kind of a need for the whole entity. They need management. Any entity needs management. That could have been staffed by paid staff, right? But you'd never be able to afford that treatment model. But the second response was the key thing. The structure that we have in place is used as an intervention. It is a clinical intervention. And when you think in that kind of language, which is very current language, it's a clinical intervention. We're saying we use a social structure, which means roles, expediter, coordinator, and so on. We use the roles, the social roles in that structure as for interventional purposes. We're trying to essentially engage the individual in a clinical process of self-discovery by using the social structure to do that. That's the difference between that social structure and the social structure in the Marines or the social structures in educational settings. We're not interested in the individual, we're only interested in the management side of this. Here we're saying we use social structure to be, as an intervention so individuals can learn about themselves in all the ways you've been illustrating it, in terms of learning responsibility and so on, and learning tolerance.
There's also a third aspect, and that's a teaching learning aspect to it. So this process is about teaching and learning as well.
Well, I thought it was contained in this idea
Well,
that the individual learns about themselves. They may learn skills along the way, if you mean that. They may acquire skills in that.
Yeah.
But I never oversell that side. They may learn skills, but the idea the resident in various social roles is constantly in a trial and error process. You understand? They're learning it. They may get good at it. They may not get good at it. The important issues are they increasingly learning about themselves. And as you move as a chief expediter, is this chief expediter now understanding that they're going to have to learn how to be in a community and maybe take some criticism and have their image challenged in the next intervention, which is that evening in the encounter group, so that in fact they now not only learn how to expedite, but now learn how to deal with criticism, learn how to deal with people liking them, not liking them, learn how to deal with their emotions on that and the other person's emotions on that. It's profound when you begin to talk about this methodologically.
I'm going to challenge George a bit because I've also heard you very strongly talk about therapeutic communities as a learning and teaching. And in fact, at one point even talking about, maybe we should be going to the education department for funding rather than health departments.
Yes, that's correct.
So I think that aspect can't be overlooked.
No, I'm in full agreement that every, as a matter of fact, every strategy to achieve these clinical goals always involves teaching. It's all a teaching strategy. And that teaching is primarily through the peers. And that is so that if I'm an expediter and I behave and walk and talk in certain ways and show certain attitudes during the day, somebody's going to be talking to me in the night, and that's all in the way of teaching. The new element of teaching that you might have heard me emphasizing is the one you're hearing today. And you see, even with this group, this is a sophisticated, trained group, and yet we're in a teaching mode today. You know, I'm talking to you about things that we need to understand as a kind of curriculum. And I'm saying that the new generation of TCs, that they really understand community as method, this can really be taught in a very, very systematic way to everybody walking through the door. We don't need now, we don't need extended periods of blind faith. You always need blind faith because people always have fears and they don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so that we tell them somehow just stay with it and you'll see it for yourself. Even when you explain things to them, they still may have fears. They may still need faith. That's the story of life. We explain it to ourselves and we're still afraid, you know. The structure one is often, has a high payoff intellectually for us. When you begin thinking now that the language that I would recommend that we use is that everything we do is potentially an intervention. And we can and we know what we're talking about when we say intervention. We know what we're trying to intervene with. We know what we're trying to, essentially the change that we're trying to bring about. That's the level of awareness that I want staff and residents to have. Everything we do has a purpose. That purpose usually is, essentially has a clinical one so that you would see something about yourself. Along the way, it looks like it has benefits for the whole community, and it does, but the real issue is, in the end, the outcome is the individual. I want to talk about a little bit about the verbal. I tried to change that language of simply push-ups and pull-ups to the broader language of affirmations and correctives. You know what I mean? There's a kind of fine-grained distinction, just to talk about method. I didn't talk about this morning, but I'll indulge myself for another minute. On affirmations, there are at least two subsets of affirmations that I want everybody to understand and residents to understand. There are statements of support. Stay in there, you know what I mean? Keep going. I'm with you. That same thing happened to me. Don't stop going on. Pulling. That's one way of pulling up, right? Individuals feel supportive. Those are general statements, and I love it when residents are supportive with one another and continually encouraging people to stay in the process, so to speak. But then there's another class of affirmations, which is really specific reinforcements for specific changes in the individual. This is an example of what I'll call the community as method sophistication. And we're very careless on this in our programs. We think if we just keep delivering a lot of generalized supportive statements, that we're having clinical effects on each other. But the reality is that if you parse that into at least two subgroups of verbal behavior, supportive, and then these specific, the reinforcement is, this is the change that I have seen in you. And remember, our people need real evidence that they have changed, because it's hard for them to believe that they can change. And the simple reality that other people see how I have changed. That's got to be authentic, though. You can't pinch my cheek, you understand it? And you can't write me a ticket on, or write me a blank check on that. How I've changed means my peers are really seeing something in me, you know what I mean? And teaching them to be able to make that observation, what I see in you and how you've changed, which is almost like data-driven. This is what I mean by when it's community as method, it's constantly monitoring whether you're changing. I want every resident to really be serious about it. Who's changed?
Every resident in Coolmine so far, though, is in.
Okay, it's in that line.
Affirmations every day in each other.
So this issue, this is a training issue, I realize, that we're talking about, but I'm using it now as an illustration of community as method, how very sophisticated it is. In very good programs, and particularly in certain groups, when those statements are very affirmational statements, are very accurate, you increase the likelihood of a clinical impact on that client. That I have to believe you, you know what I mean? But if I think you're simply just saying generalized statements to me, they don't have the same kind of clinical potential as we're talking about. This is just an example of the sophistication of the use of verbal strategies as clinical interventions, you know, and the kind of training that's involved in that.
And you need to be aware that if you're given push-ups, particularly early stage residents will find those difficult to hear, okay? And will report to you, well, I get loads of pull-ups, but I've never had a push-up, when you know they have, okay? So if you're given push-ups, what part of your responsibility is to make sure that they're heard. You know, you don't walk away when you say, oh, that was terrific, thanks for doing that. And it's, well, it's nothing. You don't walk away from that. You make sure that that's heard. You know, no, it wasn't nothing. It was something really
Well,
good.
you're right, but you're into the sophistication of it. I pulled this into that, and I realized that it's not a training session, but it's to highlight the sophistication of the use of verbal strategies and what their potential is. That then becomes a training issue for all of us. And I haven't seen any programs lately, to tell you the truth, where this level of sophistication is. This distinction between making supportive statements even and affirmational statements. That's one of the reasons I have when I see morning meetings and I see too much generalized supportive statements going on. I worry about that because that can slip, you know what I mean, into ritualism rather than have clinical impact. These are important training issues, but in the context of this discussion, I'm highlighting the idea of how sophisticated the community's method is when it's operating. To parse this kind of the use of using verbal strategies as interventions to change people and the kind of training that it takes to do that. Let's go to the group. Go ahead, Rod.
Just bring up one thing. We've been talking, you know, the arc of the TC and so forth and so on about the kind of the demise of the vitality of the therapeutic community. And I know, and one of the things I've really thought a lot about is, you know, the origin, going back to Synanon, the encounter group started first, and the organization formed around it.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, I believe that.
And that origin story is very important because it kind of gives a context for what really makes this whole thing work.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And I analogize it when I'm teaching, like, if you go to a riding stable, you expect to see horses. If there's no horses, you can have all the other accoutrements, but you know, it ain't happening.
Right.
We have a lot of therapeutic communities where the faculty, the staff, are not doing encounter groups themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So they're trying to foist a process off on the residents without engaging in it in themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
Which is the medical model.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm the doctor, you're the patient, you're screwed up, let me give you a prescription,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't need that stuff because I'm not sick, okay? So I think one of the fundamental problems we have in therapeutic communities, I know in the United States, these therapeutic communities, or so-called therapeutic communities, the faculty, the staff are not involved
Correct.
in encounter groups.
Correct.
So what you really have is you have the recovering staff, or staff who've gone through a recovery process. They've retired, are no longer doing the process. And the professional staff never get into the process.
Yeah.
And we're saying, what could possibly go wrong with this? Well, just about everything, you know. So you can be teaching therapeutic community
Right.
people, but if you're not participating in it yourself, if you are not actually using the processes, there is a real credibility gap. There's a fundamental hypocrisy.
No, you got it
What
right.
we've done is, what the TC did, which at the origins of it, which is still very valid, it broke the we-they dichotomy.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yes.
And what we have done in a lot of therapeutic communities, we have revived the we-they dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're teaching all this stuff without doing it ourselves.
Yep.
And one of the things I think that really is the thing that really makes, I think, therapeutic communities vital and exciting is when the staff are themselves growing and learning.
They're members of the community.
They're members of the
They're
community. And, you know, I always say, we're all on the boat together. Maybe the captain's on the boat, the person in the engine room is on the boat. When the storm hits, we're all in the storm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a real sense of alienation in a lot of our therapeutic communities where the faculty aren't part of the process.
Yeah.
And it makes the whole thing kind of phony.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
you
I
got
agree
it.
entirely, and I'll risk George's ire by going back to my stuff about recovery capital. when we did the manual for Phoenix, one of the things we said was, everyone, there are no staff, there are no residents, everyone is a TC member. Now, everyone gets paid. Some people get paid in recovery capital, in resources to sustain their recovery, and some people get paid money. But everybody's a member, everybody gets paid. Everybody gets rewarded for this involvement. And you're right, the logical progression from that is, where are the staff groups?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
The worst thing is that you have no fixed time for staff groups. I remember that when we had the TC, the old days, we had a regular time, this is staff group, and then there's a business meeting later. But then people said, well, let's do it only when we need it.
Yeah.
People start to not need it, apparently, because it's the way.
Sure.
That's one thing, you have to have it on regular time,
Right.
Yeah.
even if you don't think it's the crisis or
Sure.
whatever. Another thing was when I first came to a TC in the States, was in Dayton Village. They had a meeting with 150 residents, and Tony Jellamini was the director. And I asked him how many staff you have. He said, we're very lucky, we have 7.
Yeah.
How is it possible? So we had 10 encounter groups, 3 times a week or 2 times a week, and all the residents were running it. They get groups together to train them.
Right.
And because they were so good, they stayed a bit longer than TC anyway. But it wasn't possible because they had this discussion before and after with the 2 staff. And what I thought was also very impressive, the staff went around those groups and they said, how's it going? Has anybody something to say to me?
Mm-hmm.
Also, staff can get.
Oh, yeah.
And
Sure.
maybe this don't
Sure.
know. It's possible.
So what we are talking about in this particular illustration, and I agree with the diagnosis, of course, and this is another an example of community as method. What is the role of staff in a community as method approach? And we're beginning to elaborate what that is. The first change is staff has to see themselves as members of the community. And as members of the community, their main function is to facilitate community as method. That is, they know what community as method is, and when they're in that, they're there essentially to help assure that all of the community is operating the way it's supposed to be operating. This particular requirement that as a member of the community, you essentially live in a social setting which is totally egalitarian. That is, you basically can be in groups and be in either staff groups, staff resident groups. Those are already out of the realm of today's programs, staff resident groups, and but in a classical community as method, certainly in a future one, staff would have to. This would be the first requirement, that you see yourself as a member of the community. You will, there'll be certain functions that you have that you will carry out, but your first role is community as member, and that means that includes things like being in staff groups, being in staff resident groups, and so on. They can be prescribed, they don't have to be chaotic, they can be done in orderly ways. But that's a fast take. I want to go to another element, which is the whole issue of the encounter and the loss of the encounter and the confrontation groups, and even the misnomer of the word confrontation. This is an albatross that the TCs have been now carrying for years and years. I don't know whether I mentioned it here, but the encounter group is in my view, I think I did mention, is the most significant contribution to group process in mental health. And that is that groups of the clients themselves, the individuals in themselves in the group, essentially take responsibility for the whole process of the group, and where the distinctive element in the TC encounter and community as method, it is the one setting where individuals, face to face, which is what the word confrontation means. It doesn't mean hostility, adversity, it only means face to face. That's it. And face to face, essentially communicate with each other, where I will tell you how your behavior and attitudes, watch it now, affect me. The word is affect, not effect. Produce feelings in me. I will tell you how your behaviors and attitudes affect me. And you will tell me how your behaviors and attitudes affect you. That's all confrontation means. It could be said with feeling or without feeling. The clinical experience is that when it is said with feelings, and the feelings are real feelings, they often have a greater clinical impact. Peers begin to believe each other if they think they believe each other's feelings, because the very first requirement is that a resident, an individual, is displaying their feelings in constructive ways. You know what I mean? They'll sit in their chair and tell them if they're angry with them. They'll tell them if they hurt them. They'll tell them if they're disappointed with them. Tell them if you made them afraid, and so on. And the ability for the individuals to hear each other's feelingful statements clinically seems to make the best impact in whether you're raising their awareness, which after all is the primary objective of the encounter group, only to raise your awareness as to how your behaviors and attitudes affect other people. We now know from clinical experience, long-term follow-ups with graduates and so on, the things they remember most is they remember relationship structure and the encounter group. That's what they remember most. And so we know it's in those settings that we're producing the clinical changes that ultimately emerge as the enduring recovery of factors. That's a profound ticket to sell you now. That is, producing long-term recovery depends on individuals in the TC having certain experiences in the TC, and one of them is essentially the full experience of their own self-disclosure, and as well as learning that from the disclosure of other people. What I'm telling you about this, the research shows that when they start to have those experiences, which I've in other writings called essential experiences, if they've had that as an experience, full disclosure of themselves, as well as seeing and experiencing full disclosures from other people, these are the individuals who tend to complete programs, and they tend to, in fact, endure in their recovery. It's a very, very powerful idea. It's contained in community as method. And we're saying, gee, if we don't have an activity or a mechanism that fosters that, namely the loss of the encounter, we've already lost, as you've said, maybe all the horses are not there. Nothing's there in terms of producing that. In spite of that, you see how residents living in any community will somehow manage to do some of that in their own way anyway. You know, if you're living together, they'll manage to somehow find ways to talk to each other. All I'm saying, when it's a methodology, you're going to get that in place. You're going to have essentially the whole mechanism in place, so that has to happen, and guarantee that happens. This is part of what I mean by the refinement of the whole approach and moving it forward. And for those of you who are running programs who don't get essentially inflamed about this, I want you to see you begin moving away from this potential powerful approach, which I say, what are the transformative issues? Having that encounter process is fundamentally, you're putting in place a transformative mechanism. Yep. And seeing that happens, and it happens right, and happens in regular ways, is the key. And what adds great authenticity to that is when the staff are also in encounters, when residents see that this is a way of life, this is the way you seek the truth in life, this is the way you keep yourself steady in life. And I believe that this is the way you keep yourself steady in life. Yep. So there's 3 illustrations: the verbal issues, the use of structure as an intervention, the encounter process as a profound and unique group process intervention. It's not the only kind of group process we use, but certainly that one, you know what I mean, in there. And the loss of that has been a very, very costly for programs, very costly. And so in the future going forward, I'm hoping that if we can get a revitalization around what we mean by community as method, we can start building this up in the right way. So let me stop for the moment and see where please.
Community has method, to me, and most of the lads in here means we are each other's counsellors, you know?
Yep.
We are each other's counsellors, is that?
We're each other's counsellors, yeah. I mean, we listen to each other, we help each other, staff will be there all right, but I listen to someone else's story, I can relate to that story. So it's down to me as an individual to sit back and think, yeah, I've got potential for this, you know? And that's the way it is in here, it's a very community in here.
Okay. There's a lot to discuss on that, but that's...
Are you saying that the challenging behaviour or the encounter groups were more favourable, like say in the 70s and the 80s? Because my understanding of being involved in Coolmine for nearly over 30 years was there was quite heavy confrontational groups. So if you can picture 60 people in this room, and maybe, you're talking about the hierarchy of the synonym, which was kind of maybe a little bit to be overpowering on some people. So that type of confrontation and challenging was quite difficult on some residents. And to this day, you know, if they're lucky enough, I might meet them and say, you know what, that group was too heavy and I left. And they left the life, or they lived the life of maybe destruction for the last 40 years, you know. So the change I see now, not getting away with confrontation, that's still very important to challenge people, is a kind of a lighter approach to people, you know.
Lighter, is it?
Well, lighter approach, yeah, not as confrontational, not as challenging. Although our understanding in Ireland in the 80s, when I was involved, and I work here now at Coolmine, was that a guy came over from Daytop Village and he was dealing with Vietnam ex-cons or something. That was the approach that they used in the UK, in Phoenix House and in Dublin in the early 70s, because people were hard drug addicts and they had to be really nutted out and stripped down like an onion and built back up, you know.
That, you're right about that, and what you're describing is what happened to the encounter process. It had problems in the beginning because it was always capable, in its spontaneity, it was always capable of going off track. That could happen. So we saw a potentially very powerful approach when somehow it was self-managed right, it could achieve its optimal effects, but it was at risk to go off course a lot. And so one of the, going forward in the future, when we talk about the future of communities method, what did we learn about the encounter process, and I of course advertise it already as potentially a transformative one, and essentially try to correct what I think some of the errors are, because the whole TC was a trial and error process from day one, so yes, it did go off course, and there were kind of abuses that could occur in that. The severity of those abuses are wildly overstated by TC critics, you know, because there's not a single statistic to really describe how abusive the TC was, or what were the harmful effects of that. Occasionally a lawsuit would come up every so often, you know. So that's wildly overstated. Going forward, there's a way of training the encounter process that captures, holds the spontaneity in it, but essentially has built-in guidelines as to how to self-correct on that. I've tried to lay that out in several chapters of, you know, just break out the encounter when it's working wonderfully. Confrontation and conversation and then closure. And any skilled person would see that.
Sure, and I would have been at a conference 2 years ago, and there was a Professor Shane Butler from Trinity College, the chief of pharmaceutical, and he done a report on the Coolmine years. But it was a lot painted in a bad type of way, because he was representing probation workers and, as you say, professional workers coming into an area like Coolmine and the difficulties that they see. But yet they also see a lot of people achieving a lot of things in life and doing really well, you know. So I'd like to see them barriers being broke down with maybe this type of conference and going forward as well. You know?
Okay.
Okay, so sitting on is the founding members of the TC, yeah? So it has evolved in the last 50 or 60 years, yeah? And I think it has evolved in a very good and positive way. Because what I'm saying with my involvement in TC is since the 80s, it was quite challenging and very confrontational, yeah? A lot of people had left here. You know, a lot of people did stay and done really well, but I think on a percentage wide, you could have gotten a lot more people. So I know George was saying maybe bring in confrontation or challenging. It is very important, but I think sometimes it can become very, you know, very overwhelming for people. Okay. So like when you know, you all work with people, when people come in here from prison or being homeless, or haven't been listened to through their whole life, to come in here to be really, really challenged can be very difficult.
Yes, it can be, and that's one of the reasons I gave the quick take on understanding the word confrontation. It doesn't have to right away open up with a rip your lung out yelling, you understand that? In terms of raising awareness, the idea is I want to raise your awareness. I can do that with a whisper also if I want to raise your awareness. Yeah. If you know what you're doing in that, and everybody really needs to be trained on that issue, not on the stylized version of encounter. You know, so if you're yelling and screaming, as they did in a lot of the daytop groups, you know, that's a stylized approach. Rather than what's the real purpose of the encounter process and how can you optimally achieve those goals?
It varies from country to country and TC to TC, but generally there will be a balance of former resident staff, graduate staff, and non-graduate staff. I'm deliberately not saying professional staff because I don't think anyone is a professional in TCs because we don't have that kind of training.
Can I add something to that? Can I add
Yes.
something to that? So see staff that haven't been through a TC or been in treatment, they get learning from being in the TC. So I've been working there for 7 years, and you know I've changed my behaviours by being a staff member in there. So even though, because it's, who was it? Chuck Dietrich talked about it's not a drug treatment centre, it's a place of learning. So for me, it's a place of learning, and I've been able to address behaviours. So all staff, regardless of if they've been in a TC or not, can still learn that in that approach.
That's
Well,
You have no right to challenge me, but someone that's been through the programme or been in addiction will sit there and take it. Other staff members say, what are you doing?
Well, I think that depends on two things. I think it depends on the individual involved, and I think it depends also on the organisation involved. And frankly, if the organisation is appointing people to a TC that will not be challenged, then either their appointment process is wrong, or their induction training system is wrong, or both. Okay, but you know, there is no reason why non-graduate staff shouldn't be able to come into a TC and learn the process and be open to the process. And the process is vitally important. You know, it's the one thing that's, well, it's not the one thing, but it's a critical thing that stops the TC from morphing into some kind of cult. Is if you have this incredibly intensive, rigid, in many respects, structure that creates a therapeutic environment, there has to be a point, at some point, where anyone in that process can challenge that process. And if you can't challenge that process, then it's on its way to being a cult. And what that means is that anyone in a group, and staff should be in the groups, in my view, anyone in the group, basically the structure is off for the entirety of the group. Everyone is on one level and everyone is open to challenge.
It's quite interesting, this, and I'd like a little bit of clarity if you can. I mean, I'm quite new to TC, you know, I've been working in TC in Phoenix for a couple of years now, and the point the gentleman just made there about staff being in recovery, you know, should be more receptive. I've got staff that are not receptive to being challenged because they've done the programme 20 years ago, and it's like, you know, I'm a member of staff, you know, I'm not here to be challenged. I disagree with that. I totally disagree with it. I think we as individuals, as David just said, you know, we should all be open to be able to be challenged, and I try and include my staff within that process, within the encounter process. You know, we've sort of got a rule of thumb at the moment, is that, like, you know, well, you can't put encounter slips in on staff. Now, I disagree with that, and I've disagreed with that for a long time. I think, you know what, as you rightly said, you know, anyone that is within that TC environment, we're all TC members. You know, so I'd like a little bit of clarity on, you know, when you talked about encounter groups before, as to whether, like, you know, having separate, you talked about having separate groups for encounter groups for staff, or having one encounter group for the whole process.
Well, both mechanisms are available. That in the future communities met at TC, I would want to see a regularized staff encounter schedule for them. You know what I mean? They're doing what residents do in terms of keeping themselves current on where they are in terms of their experiences there. But then scheduled or even unscheduled, but a priori or ad hoc staff resident encounters. You know, you can either decide how many you need, how often you want to do that, you know what I mean, or whether you want to do that on demand. But it should be available, and nobody should be afraid of that process, is what I'm getting at.
The majority of my staff have actually been through TC, okay, and the responses that we get a lot of the time is, I'm not in treatment no more.
That's right. That's one of the issues of recovered staff, and it shows essentially the impasse that they've come to in their own recovery, is that they've got essentially, they're stuck in an image now in terms of where they are, and their own growth has stalled. And that's one of the reasons we talk about, if we're going to make a change, you know what I mean, how do you move forward?
On YouTube now, we have a lot of videos that we've made, a lot of boards. This thing will eventually end up on YouTube, what we're doing here. I made a 3-volume thing on the encounter group, improving encounter groups. Historical footage of Synanon, historical footage of Daytop, and kind of the evolution of encounter groups and therapeutic communities, with some examples of really good ones and some examples of really horrible ones, okay? And it might be useful to really look at that, because most people were talking about Synanon, they weren't there. So what was taken from Synanon in many ways was the lowest form of the encounter group, which got transferred to some of the, beating people over the head repeatedly as a learning experience was not very effective. And it did. It caused, we had very, very high dropout rates, and part of it was because people didn't like being beaten over the head. I was taught, and when I learned encounter groups in Synanon in my 20s, it had to be, listen outside the door. Is there laughter? Are there tears?
Right.
Is there really serious talk? Is there some yelling and screaming, Do you have the 360 degrees of human expression in a group?
That's
and
it.
if you don't have that, it wasn't a very good group.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
We are now dramatically running out of time. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Well,
I just wanted to clarify something I was saying about anyone in the group being open to challenge, because it occurs to me that that's a pretty sweeping generalization. Firstly, the person who's not open to challenge in the group is going to be the facilitator, unless he makes a balls of it, frankly. But, at some point, somebody has to be driving the bus. So generally, the facilitator would not be open to challenge. And the other exception, I think, comes from the work of people like Dirk van der Velde at De Kiem, who've started the Welcome House, which has now been imported into Phoenix Futures and into a couple of other European TCs. And in that system, new residents will come not straight into the TC, but into the Welcome House, and will visit and observe aspects of the TC. And this is having a huge impact on retention. So it is important that people in Welcome Houses, or certainly in TCs that operate that system, are able to come to a group and become confident that they are going to simply observe that group, and somebody won't suddenly round on them and say, what the fucking... So that there are some exceptions to that, but the generalization, I think, is correct, that it avoids a descent into the cult, and it is important. It's part of the TC process that everyone is open to challenge in the group, that the system is open to challenge in the group.
I think it all comes back to the point of people understanding the process, and it just reminded me of the preparation process we used to run at Lifeline, where we used to have 1 or 2 individuals who were going to a TC, and we would take them as individuals through a sort of confrontative process, role play basically, the sort of confrontation, the feelings, getting people to do stuff, so they would understand, actually physically understand what they were going to be going through.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know we're going to, Martin, you're going to...
Just one comment on the Synanon groups. I was there. I was surprised of the fun, the laughter.
Oh, yeah.
That's not so strong, aggressive encounter that I expected. Not all, sometimes, I think for welcoming new staff members who have no experience at all, like a psychologist or a social worker, in the past we had as a resident in another TC, like us, not in the same one, of course, being a resident for a month. They still do it in some countries, I know. Some it's difficult to do it because of the rules and so on. And then you can say you still want to be with us, and if not, it's up to you, and they then understand it.
Sure.
If it cannot be done, at least have them in observing or whatever way to learn and see what it is. Otherwise, there's so much fear.
Okay.
Just to be there, that they probably say, well, it's better to have individual sessions and so on, something they know, and you get destroyed the whole system.
Sure.
Can I just say something because I'm living proof of the first person trained that way in the UK. So I was put into I was a staff member at Lee Community, and I went into Alpha House as a resident. And so I had 5 weeks as a resident. I cried when I had to leave the girls' dorm and go into, this is 1974, I'm still here and alive, still working around TCs. I have to say though, the interesting thing that happened after me was the guy who went for training after me, they thought he was so screwed up, they kept him a resident for 3 months, and he didn't really survive terribly well. But the way in which you train your staff, of course, is a really important aspect. And so that just, the point that you were making before about, whether people were open to confrontation or not. I've worked in and out of TCs, for many, many years. And I have to say that one of the greatest compliments I had when I left Carolika, which is in Canberra, in Australia, for the last time, because I'd been backwards and forwards a few times, was that one of the residents said to me at my farewell, he said, in all the years I've known you, I didn't know which program you went through. So what were you a graduate of? And I said, I really take that as a compliment, that for all of the time that you've known me and for the, the years that I've worked, actually you didn't know the difference between me being here as a so-called professional staff and as someone who
Well, it illustrates a very important point that we've been talking about in terms of the leveling of the people. We're all in this existential struggle.
Yeah.
Let me. I know we have to. We're on a timeline.
Yeah,
Before we stop, though, a little simple mechanism we all use in the TC. A little bit of feedback on this discussion today, because we've only got a few minutes left, I think, right? So, what was our stop time?
About no minutes.
What? No minutes.
About no
We-
minutes.
we
Yeah.
Well, just 5 minutes of feedback. Just on that.
Well, can I just say one quick thing? I know I mentioned the addicted staff and the professional staff. That was something I heard about 15 years ago in the training courses, which I felt very offended by. And that's why I used it, So, I mean, there's no difference, I think, I think everybody has a lot to contribute with the book,
Well, George, I would just say, in terms of feedback, when you don't have the encounter group, you lose member feedback. And that's essentially what the encounter group is for, is for member feedback. Without that element, regardless, I've been a new student or new, resident at Amity Foundation. I've been an executive at Amity Foundation. Regardless of my position, you have to remain open to member feedback. And you have to be able to give it and receive it both. And I think that without that element of TC, you become a corporation and not a community. And that's one of the most important things in terms of losing the culture of the TC that we have to be careful of.
Okay.
I think also the encounter group offers the corrective equivalent of the affirmative specific reinforcement, and it has the clinical impact. I think I absolutely agree with everything we're saying about everyone being involved and being open to challenge, but I think remembering the clinical impact that the encounter group has on the individual is absolutely key as well.
Okay.
Let me finish with a piece of positive affirmation, because I sat through the graduation last night, and what struck me was that as far as I'm aware, and bear in mind it was a pretty awful PA system in that venue, so sometimes I couldn't hear exactly what people were saying, but as far as I could tell, I think that every graduate that went up last night thanked not only the staff, but made a point of thanking their peers. And that really stood out for me, because what that says to me is that those were graduates who'd got it, who understood that it wasn't about this is what my key worker did or this is what the staff did, but my peers did this for me. So
That was
important
encouraging.
stuff.
Again, any closing feedback on our general discussion today? How do you think it went?
Just not to be afraid to continue to run the TC as it's supposed to be run, and not having our heads turned a little bit with lots of other add-ons, there's lots of things that we feel pressurised, certainly as running the TC, to incorporate, and it can kind of detract from the actual TC foundations and the message.
Yes.
So I think it's like reassurance. Don't be afraid to say, no, that's not what we're offering, or no, that's not what we're providing. We know it works, it's evidence-based, and we've got lots of, kind of historical evidence to show that, and it's about not being afraid, I think, to say, no, we're not providing that, or no, we're not going to have that as part of our programme.
In the ideal world, that is the proper way. You're right.
Yeah.
But again, I guess I've asked it 3 times, and I don't know whether we're going to get it.
No, we're not.
We're not going to get it, okay. Well, then, let me extend my appreciation for your coming and for listening to this.
Yeah, thanks.
My hope is that it'll move us, something about this will try to move us forward. I was trying to get a sense from you what was resonating and what wasn't. But over the next couple of days, I know one of the presentations that I will make is a formal one, and that will really just, in a little bit more detail, talk about some of the evolutionary issues the barriers that have occurred at the TCs. But that'll be a little bit of a more formal talk in one of the plenaries, I think. And where are you on say goodbye to these folks?
Goodbye.